this chapter 7, is a chapter looking at the Texas legislature. The two things we want to start off with is to make sure we understand what a legislature in general is, as we have with most of our major definitions, and then we'll jump into the 7 different functions of the legislature. So what is a legislature? A legislature is an organization that is built around being, first and foremost, a representative organization. Its job is to represent the constituents of the people that were elected and put into that organization. So the Texas legislature, right, made up of the House and the Senate, is populated by folks that have been elected from their House districts and their Senate districts across the state of Texas to go into those two organizations, the legislature as a whole, and stand up for their constituents and their constituents' needs, and to try to represent them in a democratic manner. Now, again, we've been talking about Texas as a republic, just like the United States is a republic. So it's a representative form of government, a form of democracy. So our desires as individuals, right, are carried by our representatives into the legislature, and then through their representation there, those desires are turned into policy if we're lucky. Hopefully, certainly should be the case, it's turned into discussion and debate and a serious concern about our issues. So the purpose, right, of any legislative organization, and especially the Texas legislature, is to be that place where democracy happens. That place where we expect the desires of the constituents of Texas to be aired, to be discussed, to be debated, to be written up into a bill and submitted to a committee, and right, some time spent covering those issues. As we transition from just understanding that the legislature is our main representative body in the state of Texas and the government of Texas, we can start looking to the actual functions of the legislature, the things that it are expected to fulfill as duties to the people of Texas. And as we've discussed, right, the nature of the legislature is to be representative, and that's its first function, right, to represent the people. Most of the time when we just are generally talking to people and we ask them what's the function or what does the Texas legislature do, they're going to jump to the second issue on this list. They're going to tell us the legislature makes the laws of Texas. And while that is a very prominent function of the legislature, it would technically, the legislature, fulfill its main obligations simply by meeting in a representative session every 2 years, as the Constitution lays out, and representing what we need. Now, we wouldn't be happy with just the legislature coming together and acting as a large body of representation. We expect to see some results, right? We expect to see some policy development. We expect to see some product from that representation. And that's where the rest of these functions will filter out as product, as policy, and as practice. So as the legislature meets every biennium, right, beginning first Tuesday in January, or first Tuesday in the second week of January, I guess, is what we're looking at. It's going to meet, right, and all of those representatives are going to come together, and the things that they're going to do as they represent us are the rest of the things on this list. Prominent on that is what people generally think of, and that's legislation, to legislate, which means to look at our laws, to see what the impact of our current legislation is and what it's doing, and is it appropriate, and is it meeting the needs of Texans, and then to consider whether that should be altered to address changing times, whether there needs to be new legislation to address things that haven't been brought forward before, or issues that we haven't faced before, or possibly issues that we haven't had a political will that was large enough to merit action and results. But legislation is what most of their time, if you were to look at it, legislators are doing, right? The easiest way to represent your constituents is to bring forward their concerns and to put it forth into a bill for consideration to become law. And so an inordinate amount of their time is spent discussing the impact of current legislation, seeing where it works, where it doesn't work, what might be new, discussing how you might craft new legislation to address new instances or possibly some oversights or some problems with legislation that's already in place. That's assuming, right, that these legislators are looking mainly after the concerns of their constituents. We shouldn't, or we would be remiss if we didn't recognize that legislation comes from more than just concerns of constituents, right? It's sometimes driven by popular opinion, which would overlap with what constituents want ideally. Sometimes it's driven by a national narrative. Sometimes legislation is driven by the desires, needs, and political perspectives of the legislators that are in office. Quite often you can look to our state legislators and see that they are responding to probably a bigger or larger political pressure than just that's coming from their constituents. And sometimes that's to maybe address something they think is affecting Texas as a whole, or Texas in particular from a national perspective. Or it might be that they're going to legislate something that's going to look good for them as legislators, possibly looking to move into higher office at some point. So legislation can be driven by a lot of different factors, a lot of different perspectives. Ideally, that legislation will be traceable back to what constituents in Texas are asking for, problems that they're having, and that they think the government is the appropriate place to try to address that issue. And in particular, in this case, the state government, the Texas legislature. So a lot of their time, once they're in office and they're in their legislative session, are going to be focused on the impacts of previous legislation, maybe the need for new legislation. So legislating it's hard to overstate how much they're going to be doing it. Second function, or third function to look at here, is their budgeting and taxing function. As you covered the material on in the lecture on Constitution, you realize that, right, one of the things government has to do to be able to be effective is to raise money and so that it can spend money, right? You can't legislate, you can't implement legislation, you can't do the things that people are asking for if you do not have income. And so the state of Texas needs to generate income. Once it does, of course, what it's trying to do with that income is controlled by a budget, right? And that budget is dictating in Texas how much money is going to be spent on what task. And so budgeting for a state the size of Texas, with the policy purview as large as the state of Texas, it's going to be a very large budget, which a lot of money is going to be organized and pigeonholed, be spent in particular areas. Most of our state budget is built upon previous state budgets. We're not creating new budgets every legislative session. But every legislative session, the primary piece of legislation that is submitted is the budget bill, which explains in detail, right? It's usually 800 to 1,000 pages long, right? If they publish it as a book. And it says, here's the proposal of where we think we're going to spend money over the next 2 years, based upon where we've spent money in the past and where we think we're going, and should that past expenditure be increased or decreased? What's the political challenges that we face, and how's that changed where we want to put our money? One good thing to keep in mind when you're looking at a function like budgeting for any organization, but especially a political one, is that budgets are really a clean and clear perspective of the values of the organization that's putting that budget together. Since the Texas legislature is primarily responsible for generating our budget, we can look at that budget and you can just essentially look at it and see where they're spending money, how much money there is, and you can sit there and rank order the importance of those issues based upon the amount of money that's being spent there. You want to know what's important to Texas? Ideally, if our system is working correctly, what's important to Texas constituents? Look at the amount of money we budget for what task in the budget. And so it is the primary piece of legislation every legislative session. It is necessary for our government to keep running, that they budget this out. And we'll talk later about constitutional limit on how much money we spend, right? That we have a debt limit in Texas, a constitutional requirement that we balance our budget. And so when we're putting this budget together, this budget has to work in conjunction with how much money we're going to be bringing in. And that perspective of it is really the taxing perspective of the function of the legislature, whether it's a true tax in the sense of a sales tax, or whether it's a service charge that works as a tax, like you get when you go to a state agency and try to get some work done to get a license or something like that, and you have to pay a fee. Or if you go to buy a gallon of gas, how much of that gallon, the cost of that gallon of gas is being redirected toward state coffers. All of that taxing, all of that way of bringing income into the state's coffers, right, has to match up with the budget that they're writing. So our budget is in a large sense dictated by the amount of money we believe that we're going to be raising over the same time that budget is in place. So the budgeting and the taxing functions work hand in hand. You have to have them both going together for it to work. At any point, if your desire is that government should be smaller or government should be less pervasive, the best way to probably, or quickest way to probably attack that and reduce the impact of the footprint of government is to look at the amount of taxes that you're raising and then how much of that is going into the budget. As legislators get more experience in the Texas legislature and how it works, you will tend to see them trying to work their way into assignments that will have them working on budgeting and taxing, because this is the right engine that makes the whole government run. And when you get your finger on that, right, then you're having, as a legislator, a better or larger impact on how Texas government's going to work going forward. And so if you look to the Senate and the House committees that are working on the budget and working on appropriations, these are the committees that generally have your most politically connected and your most experienced legislators on them, right? And because they're controlling the purse strings of the state government. So it's a very important part of the function that the legislature fulfills, right? It has to sit down and figure out its budget. It has to figure out what it's wanting to do and how much that's going to cost, and does it have the income to support that through taxing and service fees and such? And if not, do they put that work off, or do they increase how they try to bring in money to support that budget? Either way, at the end of it, the budget needs to have pretty much, right, whatever it wants to spend has to be accounted for in the taxation schemes that are in place to generate income for the state. Those two need to work hand in hand. Fourth on the list of functions is constituent casework. This is the work that legislators do in direct response to claims made from their constituents. Quite often, what is going on as constituents contact their representatives is they're saying, look, my understanding is the Texas government's supposed to be providing X. I'm not getting X. I've contacted who I think are all the right people and I'm not getting satisfaction. You're my representative. Can you see what's going on here and see if you can fix this problem for me? And legislators have, some small amount of staff, and that staff, part of their job, right, is to do this casework. When a constituent calls in and says, hey, I'm a constituent of this representative, this senator, I'm having this problem. Can you fix this for me? That's real work that the staff of that legislator is going to be focused on. And they're going to take information down from that constituent. They're going to try to figure out what the case is and should there be some government service there? Is there something that's missing? And their job is going to be to get in touch with whoever it is in the state government that is doing that work and see what the issue is. That's not a small part of what they do on a daily basis. And as someone who worked in state government for 20 years or so, I can't tell you how many times, but a bunch, I've been contacted, right, by a staff member of the legislature in the Texas legislature saying, hey, we had this person call, they said they were working with your group and they're not getting satisfaction. What can you tell us about it? And the work that goes on there is the person in the bureaucracy that's responsible for doing that, or at least accounting for it, working with those legislators' staff to figure out what the problem is and to fix it. Now, sometimes there's nothing to fix, and you just explain to a staff member, okay, here's what the law says. Here's how we've interpreted that into our rules, and this is what we do. And so this person called into us and wanted X, and we told them to do X, you need to do 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they've done 1, 2, and 3, but they've never done 4. And we've told them 2 or 3 times to do 4, and they haven't. So the right answer from our perspective is get them to do 4. I would say that probably 90 to 95% of my interaction with staff members and that level have been of that kind of interaction. And then the staff member from the legislature calls the constituent back and says, okay, we looked at it, here's the rules, here's the law. The bureaucracy is doing this way and it's proper. And so you need to do this part right here. And when you do, things will be taken care of. Quite often, my experience in that is that constituent will then carry that work out with that staff member of the legislator, and then that staff member will get it to us. And then as we respond appropriately to that and say send a license out to that individual, we'll also, at the point we send that out, make sure that we have copied the legislator staff member saying, here's us finishing the job, here's us meeting, they sent us to that, we got it from you or whatever, we've taken care of it, this issue is finished. That's a routine, everyday kind of occurrence for the staff members of the legislature, and that's them making sure that the constituents of that legislator get the service that they're supposed to get, whether it's on a misstep on the part of the constituent, or maybe it's a misstep on the part of the bureaucracy following through, or whatever the case may be. Those staff members working right for a senator or a House member are ensuring that their constituents, the people that elected that individual, get the proper service from the state government. And so that's something that is constituents you should be aware of, right? if you think the state government's not doing its job right for you as an individual, you're engaged with it. One of your options is to contact your representative in the House or the Senate and say, hey, help me out here. And my experience is that they will, right? They'll find the answer. It may not be the answer that you want, but they'll find the right answer, and they'll instruct you on how to get from A to Z or whatever you need. Following from that kind of interaction from the legislature to the bureaucracy and ensuring that constituents get what they need is another element or function of the legislature, which is to actually oversee the bureaucracy. What I described as casework is not necessarily the same thing as oversight, because the legislature, and we'll get a little deeper into this later in this chapter, actually has a function where their job is to review all of the pieces and parts of the bureaucracy in Texas. And this goes in ties in well with the budgeting as well, to look at, do we need this part of the bureaucracy? If we do, is that bureaucracy doing what it's supposed to do? Is it doing it in the most efficient way? Is there some impediment to the bureaucracy being more efficient or effective, possibly because of the way the law is written, possibly because of the way the law is being interpreted for its implementation? So the legislature, in a large part, is continually reviewing how the bureaucracy, who is responsible for implementing law, right, for taking all of that legislative work, all of that budgeting work and taxing work, and turning it into action, are they doing that job right? And there's no group or organization better situated to oversee the bureaucracy than the folks that wrote the law that the bureaucracy is implementing. So in that sense, at a very high level perspective, the legislature has a function to ensure that the bureaucracy is doing its job, is doing it as intended, is still needed, and if it's not needed, to get rid of it. Or is there possibly duplication because of law passed here and a law passed here, each creating a piece of bureaucracy to take care of and implement that law, or assigning it to an existing bureaucracy? And is there overlap there? And could we make the bureaucracy more efficient by combining and streamlining? So there's a real oversight function here for the legislature, which has them looking generally from session to session at a big picture perspective and through the budget, and then through their own staff's experiences working with the bureaucracy. Are they doing what they're supposed to do? Are there tons of complaints? Are they getting the job done? And so they will oversee the bureaucracy in that general fashion. Later, we'll talk about how they do a much more specific deep dive into bureaucracies and oversight there. The next function that the legislature fills is one that has to do with constitutions. Texas legislature has a role to play explicitly in both how we amend the U.S. Constitution and the Texas Constitution. Starting with the Texas Constitution, most, if not all, of the amendments to the Texas Constitution are proposed within the Texas legislature and are then come out of the Texas legislature as a proposal to go to on the ballot for an election for ratification by the citizens. So if we want to expand, change, reduce, alter the Texas Constitution, the legislature, right, is going to do that, is going to initiate it for us. And that's the most practical and obviously the way that most often we propose amendments to the Texas Constitution. We can do that. There are other ways to try to approach that, but not nearly as effective. So when you look, and if you vote in November of any midterm election year, any off presidential year, you're going to see Texas constitutional amendments up for a vote. And so you go to the polls, you're going to be voting not just for state officials and representatives. You're going to be looking at propositions for constitutional amendments that came out of the Texas legislature. And as a citizen voting, you'll have the ability to weigh in on that. On the U.S. Constitution, Texas legislature potentially and generally has a position to play in ratification of amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So at the U.S. level, we see constitutional amendments proposed by the U.S. Congress or through a convention of the states. That can happen as well. Those proposed amendments, though, are then pushed down to the states for ratification, and the states can ratify in two ways. One of the ways is to have a convention in the state, and we have where citizens all come together and vote on it. Never really used. What happens is that constitutional amendments, for the most part, to the U.S. Constitution come down to the states and are ratified within the state legislatures. So when we elect our representatives, we're not just electing them to represent us at the state level. There's also the potential for them, if an amendment comes down from the federal government, that they'll be representing us as that moves through ratification in the legislature. So they have the opportunity there to function on changing the base documents for both the federal government and the state government on a routine basis in the state level. And then the final function, and one that we don't see exercised all that often, although it probably should be at a little more often than it is the ability to both impeach, accuse state officials of corruption, of misusing their office, of not living up to their requirements as legislators or elected officials or judges, and then remove them from office. The impeachment and conviction process, right, at the Texas level for state elected officials is very similar to what goes on at the federal level, right? Someone is accused, that's brought forward. The House is responsible for looking into whether there's enough evidence and to impeach them, right? In a sense, I like to think of it as impeaching their character as an elected official. And that means to bring an official complaint or charge against that individual and say, hey, given what we've seen, we believe you have done wrong. And then the ability, right, within the legislature, the Senate in particular, to remove, right, to hold a trial, look at that evidence, look at the testimony, take testimony, and then remove someone from office, right? So again, we don't see that very often in the Texas legislature, but that function does exist there. All right, changing directions a little bit. Let's talk about how it is that you get into the Texas legislature. Again, the Texas legislature is made up of, it's a bicameral institution, so it's got two parts. It's got a Senate and it's got a House. The numbers in parentheses here represent the number of seats in the Senate and the House. And then the columns tell you what the requirements are particular to the Senate and the House. So these are the requirements that are in the Texas Constitution that needs to be fulfilled or met before you can legally be elected into one of these positions. So 31 seats in the Senate, so there are 31 Texas Senate districts, right? Those seats are geographical seats. That district is a particular geographical piece of land, right, that has a district boundary, and the folks that live within that boundary are the constituents of that district and are responsible for electing a representative from that Senate district. The senator of that district or the individual of that district that wants to run for the Senate or the House in this sense. House districts are geographical also. There are 150 of those, and have to also be residents of that district. So the people, right, that live in that district are voting for someone that has a residency in that district. In other words, they live in the area they're going to represent. The requirements of that residency vary based on whether you're running for Senate or running for House. If you're running for Senate, you need to be a state resident. I've lived in Texas 5 years, and you need to be, right, a current district resident that you're running for 1 year that you want to represent. If it's the House, it's a 2-year state residency and a 1-year district residency. So you have to fulfill those residency requirements to be eligible to be elected. There are age requirements. They're not very onerous, right? 26 by the time you are elected to office, and 21 for the Senate and 21 for the House. If you're elected to a Senate position, you will serve 4 years before you have to run again. In most cases, there's one example that varies from that. We'll talk about that later. If you're in a House district, you and get elected, you will serve a 2-year term, and you'll run for re-election every 2 years. You are required to be a U.S. citizen to be eligible to run for that. You are required to be a qualified registered voter, right, in the state of Texas. So all of the things that would disqualify you from voting in Texas would also disqualify you for running for office. Not only, right, must you meet the qualifications to register, you must also be registered. Now, obviously, if you're probably running for office, you're into politics, you're paying attention, you're already been voting, you're making, you've participated in elections in the past. So almost certainly the qualified registered voter thing is not a problem. However, if you are, right, a recent transplant to Texas, right, then you're going to have gotten registered. You're going to have met the residency requirements, right? You're going to have to meet all of these things prior. And these would be elements that you need to consider ahead of time. Your salary is not much. Constitution sets the salary at $600 a month for each of these positions, House or Senate, or basically $7,200 a year. So this is not a job that you're going to consider a full-time, make a living off of salary kind of job. Now, in parentheses, I have a per diem there of 190. I think that's has been changed recently to about $210 or $220. Per diem is Latin for per day. This is a limit on the amount that you can expense while you're doing your job. So let's say you are a representative from Lubbock, and right, you have to live in whatever district is around Lubbock that you're going to represent. So that's where your home is. But you got to come to Austin to do your work, right? Especially when the legislature's in session, but some other times as well. While you were traveling and staying in Austin to do your work as a representative or as a senator, the per diem is the amount that of expenses that you can charge back to the state, or you can get compensated for from the state. So essentially, you're filling out a sheet saying, here's the money I spent while I was doing my job in Austin. My hotel room, or my rent, or my electricity, or my gas, or my food. And you submit that request with your receipts to the government, and they will reimburse you up to, right, whatever the per diem limit is at the time. This is not just for representatives, right? This is for state employees as well. So I've done this a lot of times, right? My job would require me to travel a little bit through the state, maybe stay a few nights, and so to get your job done, and then you come back. Well, those few days where you're out and about, you're applying, you're living within the per diem. And then when you get back, you have to submit all that to get the money back. So you're spending your own money up front and then getting that paid back to you on the back end, as long as you stay under the limit. Anything you spend over the limit, that's your cost. So the impact, right, things to think about here a little bit on the salary issue is that this impacts who can probably run and be elected to the legislature, right? If the job is going to pay you $600 a month, you're not going to live off that probably. That's probably not enough money. I couldn't do it. And so the folks that are looking to run for these positions obviously have other support, financial support for themselves, whether that's own their own business, they have their own farm or ranch, the business that they're work in has wants them to be a legislator and will keep paying them, right, while they're serving in the legislature. So they'll have a salary from whatever that business is plus their $7,200, which means you're probably something like a lawyer, right, an attorney. So this limitation on how much you can get paid per month serves to, in a real world circumstance, probably limit who's going to be running for office. It doesn't limit who's eligible, right? But when you look at the practicalities of living off $600 a month in your per diem, not going to be probably working for you as paying all your bills. And so in a sense, it works as today as a kind of self-selection process. Now, 7,500 years ago, maybe 600 was a different number, right? And had a different impact, but we haven't changed it. It's in the Constitution. This is what you're going to get paid. So you have to make sure that if you're going to run for office, you have some other financial support, because it's not going to be enough probably from the state. Final thing here as a constitutional requirement is that when you hold a state office, especially if it's a representative office or an appointed office where you're going to be passing legislation or implementing legislation, you have to make sure that if your outside interests conflict, right, or overlap with legislation you're working on, that you have to talk about that. You have to tell somebody. You have to fill out paperwork saying, hey, this bill deals with, how we're going to treat agricultural land, and I'm a farmer or a rancher, and I've got this many acres, and it's going to impact me if it's passed. And so I'm filling out a conflict of interest form to say, right, put everybody on notice that this bill is going to impact me personally. Now, there's no requirement that you necessarily recuse yourself from voting on that bill, although sometimes people will, especially if they've got a well-developed sense of perspective on what they should and shouldn't be doing. But there's not a requirement that you recuse yourself or remove yourself from that decision-making process as a legislator. So the requirement is that you notify and put people on notice and fill out the form. The other limitations on you as an individual when you're serving in state office is that you can't hold two state offices at once. You can only be, right, you can't be the county judge in a county and the Senate senator from that Senate district. You only get one. And you also, right, need to ensure that contracts that are in place that you as a business person might have with the state are no longer enforced once you take your position. The idea here is, of course, is to try to ensure that representatives are representing their constituents and not just themselves. Okay, earlier I mentioned that generally as a senator, you're going to be serving a 4-year term when you're elected to office. The exception to that I said we'd talk about a little later is this. Every 10 years, the federal government does a census. And that census is going to impact, right, representation both at the federal level and the state level, because we're counting people and we're finding out where they are. And our electoral districts, right, the size of those electoral districts are based upon how many people are in them. So we want to ensure in Texas that all of our electoral districts are generally, right, shaped so that they have the same number of people in them. So if you compare Senate District 1 to Senate District 2, they should be relatively close to one another in the populations that live in that district. Now, the same thing applies to the House districts, but we don't have to worry about the census impacting them because we elect those House members every 2 years. The census comes in on results are done on an even year. The results come out at the end of that even year. The Texas legislature meets in an odd number year, right? This is right now, as I'm saying, this is 2021. Texas legislature's in a session right now, and they're in their third special session. And part of what they're doing is they're right now looking at the results of the decennial U.S. Census, and they're redistricting. In other words, they're redrawing the Senate and House district lines so that it accounts for the number of people that have moved into Texas, the number of people that are born here, the number of people that have moved out of Texas, the number of people, how the population has moved within Texas. And we're adjusting those districts so that they have pretty much the same number of people in all of them. That piece of legislation will be passed in this odd number year. And in the even number year, we'll have an election we'll have an election this November that will elect people for the even number year to take their seats. Since the House is on a 2-year rotation, right, it always is going to be people elected in that odd year to take the seat, the even number year. So the census, while it changes the districts, doesn't impact the House because the House is on a 2-year schedule. The Senate, however, is on a 4-year schedule, and we split the Senate up so that half the Senate's being elected every other year. And we stagger those so that, right, half the Senate is serving 4 years, and that overlaps the 4-year period of the other half of the Senate. And this causes a bit of an issue once the census comes in, because now we need to redraw all of the census, all of the Senate district lines to match the results of the census, which means that if you were elected 2 years before the census came out, you're going to serve a 2-year Senate term and then get reelected. And so what we will see happen in elections occurring right after the census is that state senators will be elected to either a 2-year term or a 4-year term. And that will then put them back on that rotating basis, that staggered basis of having senators, right? Half the Senate be elected every 2 years, but each senator serving 4 years at a time. So every decade, every decennial census, every decade when we do a census, we have to make this electoral change to Senate terms so that we can get the stagger working again. So Senate elections beginning of the decade get altered a bit so that we can reinitialize the staggered election process. Okay, so I think that's enough for this piece of the lecture, and we'll stop there.